The Russian defense industrial complex serves as the beating heart of the Russian armed forces and domestic manufacturing, representing one of the nation's largest employers with millions of workers in hundreds of companies and factories across the country. And it's also almost entirely controlled by the state because it's responsible for security, sovereignty, is an active deterrent against NATO, and it projects Russian power across Europe and Asia. Well, that's how it worked before 2022. And now, after the invasion that began, it basically only serves as the fuel to the growing wildfire in Ukraine. And that brings us to the inevitable question: can Russian industry keep up with the demands of the ongoing war? But before we answer that, let's get some context by going a little bit back in time.
Soviet President Mikhail Gorbachev has been removed from power, and there are tanks now in the streets of Moscow.
The fall of the Soviet Union brought chaos and instability to everyday Russian life, but it also brought many opportunities to the defense industry. The Russian Federation, being the direct successor to the Soviet Union, inherited the bulk of defense technology and arms industries. This inheritance secured Russia's position as a major player in the defense sector. But there were also some problems. A lot of the weapon systems and components in the Russian arsenal were produced in other former Soviet states like Ukraine and Belarus. And cooperation between these states was tolerated for a time, but the Russians had just been downgraded from a global superpower to now a regional power. And this required them to radically reevaluate what they wanted the capabilities of their military to be, but also their neighbors too. I mean, remember, these guys just went from being part of the same union to now independent states. That means independent laws, independent governments, and especially independent militaries. Militaries that could potentially be a threat to Russia in the future, especially if the Russians wanted to, invade and forcefully annex parts of them, as a random example. So the goal immediately became lowering their dependency on countries like Ukraine for their weapons and components, but also develop a bunch of new technology that could help them outscale these neighbors who just inherited large stockpiles of their own. Now, to accomplish this, the Russians would need to be self-sufficient. But at this time, that's basically impossible, because the Russians lacked the infrastructure, the industrial base. They couldn't produce all this complex hardware on their own. This forced them to turn to their former enemy, the West. And as they decreased their dependence on Ukrainian and Belarusian components, they increased their dependency on Western components. Now let's move from the 90s to the early 2000s. Putin comes to power, he brings new leadership to the Kremlin and Ministry of Defense, and the situation overall in Russia seems to be stabilizing. I mean, sure, you have dependence on Western companies growing as Russia builds up its military power, but that didn't seem like a big problem at the time. Russia's relations with their neighbors were still pretty good, and some of them even remained in the Russian sphere of influence. But that was until 2003, when a small country on Russia's border got the bright idea to install a pro-Western government. Georgia was in a really tight spot after the fall of the Soviet Union. They just had two self-proclaimed republics declare independence, and they were able to remain independent thanks to the generous assistance of Russia. But Georgia's decision to westernize, maybe even join the EU, or God forbid NATO, posed a serious threat to Russian ambition in the region. So relations between the two countries rapidly deteriorated over the next few years, and it all came to a head in 2008, when Russia falsely accused Georgia of aggressing on the citizens of one of these breakaway republics. So Russia naturally decides to build up tens of thousands of troops along the border and launch a full-scale invasion of the country.
Georgia is in full regime of self-defense against unfounded and totally legitimate aggression from the Russian Federation.
Now that I'm thinking about it, that sounds kind of familiar, doesn't it? Anyways, the invasion only lasted a few days, but the Russians got exactly what they wanted, which was de facto control over these new breakaway republics. And the price Russia paid for this action was very low, because the Western powers had turned a blind eye, despite this being a clear act of aggression. The 2008 invasion of Georgia coincided with Russia's new-look military reforms. The newly appointed Minister of Defense, Anatoly Serdyukov, wanted to streamline Russian military logistics through these reforms, and I'm going to go into more detail of these reforms in a future video, but for now, all you really need to know about this period is that Russian dependence on foreign weapons systems and components, mostly from the West and Ukraine, kept growing and growing and growing. In 2012, Putin became the president of Russia again, and one of the first things he did was fire Serdyukov for a big corruption scandal that rocked the MOD. Speaking of corruption, I totally forgot to talk about Russia's rampant corruption problem. The Russian military has been corrupt basically from its inception in the 90s, and this corruption is endemic throughout the entire chain of command. You have the current Minister of Defense, Sergei Shoigu, with his $18 million mansion. You have recruiting officials who artificially inflate their recruitment numbers and fighting forces. There's frontline commanders who are outright lying about the state of their equipment and personnel, rampant thievery of weaponry and even armor off of the tanks. I mean, think about it. Tank effectiveness literally relies on their armor, but in some cases, they're hollowing it out and selling it off. And the worst part about this corruption is that it's either sanctioned by the Russian government or they just completely ignore it, meaning that there are thousands of personnel up and down the chain of command who are exploiting, cheating, and stealing under the current system, and they're getting away with it. Alright, so let's go back to the Ministry of Defense. There's this big corruption scandal involving embezzlement of billions of rubles, and it basically forced Putin to replace Serdyukov with Sergei Shoigu in 2012. So Shoigu comes in, and he immediately sees all the red flags with Serdyukov's foreign equipment spending spree, so he orders the lowering of foreign product purchases for new weapon systems. But by now, most of the damage has already been done. For years, Russia's been importing thousands of different products and equipment from the West, which are used in a large amount of their weapon systems. And they've already spent hundreds of millions of dollars on all this hardware. But don't worry, every problem has a solution. And our man Shoigu, he's a go-getting problem solver. And he started the process of replacing all these components with Russian-manufactured parts. Now this process is very difficult, very expensive, and very time-consuming. One of the most difficult parts being the replacement of the Ukrainian components. You see, Russia has been slowly integrating Western components and equipment into their systems for only around 20 years at this point, but they've been using Ukrainian equipment for decades and decades, going all the way back to the heydays of the Soviet Union. And replacing all that hardware is an extremely difficult task. Now, the area of greatest cooperation between Ukrainian and Russian defense industries was in avionics and rocket engine systems. And despite previous attempts to lower this dependence over the years, the Russians were still buying aircraft kits, rocket engines, and an assortment of other important complex electronic systems from Ukraine. That is until 2014. Viktor Yanukovych, the Ukrainian president at the time, was persuaded by Putin to reject the EU and keep Ukraine in the Russian sphere of influence. Now, this was a huge upset to the Ukrainian people, who then decided to rise up in late 2013, early 2014, in what became known as the Maidan Revolution. And it basically culminated in the Ukrainian parliament ousting Yanukovych from power, and a new pro-Western interim government was installed. This revolution was seen by Putin and Russians supporting Ukrainians as an illegitimate coup, resulting in counter-protests and violence springing up across the country, mostly in the south and the east. And in all this chaos and turmoil, Vladimir Putin decided to intervene, and he launched a limited invasion of Ukraine. He seized and annexed the Crimean Peninsula, helped set up the breakaway republics of Donetsk and Luhansk, and started a proxy war between Russia and Ukraine in Donbass. As you've probably pieced together, all of these actions came straight out of the playbook of the Russian invasion of Georgia in 2008. And the Western powers finally took notice, so they responded by imposing harsh sanctions on the Russian defense industrial complex and many Russian officials and companies. These sanctions, along with the ongoing hostilities with Ukraine, cut the Russians off from their biggest providers of components and weapon systems, putting their defense and offense capabilities at risk. In 2015, the effects of sanctions materialized when Russian stockpiles started to deplete, and remaining contracts with Western companies began to expire. So Putin signed a decree ordering the implementation of an import substitution program. And he also formed a state commission with the goal of overhauling and replacing foreign components in all sectors of Russian life, civilian and military, which they wanted to have mostly completed by 2018. But the Russians aren't really known for their economic efficiency, and the biggest problem with this program was the lack of modern machinery for the production of all these new components, and sanctions prevented them from importing all this technology from the West, so they regularly missed annual replacement targets by large margins, forcing them to push the deadline back from 2018 to 2025. The import substitution program was largely a failure, as even today there are huge amounts of Russian weaponry with foreign-made components. And after failing to produce them domestically, the Russians acquired many of these components indirectly by smuggling them in from countries who were not under sanctions. So along with the actual war happening in Donbass, Russia also escalated its propaganda war against Ukraine and the West, which turned out to be a bit of a double-edged sword. Turning their population against the West led to demands of military expansion and further aggression in Ukraine, two things the Russians couldn't really afford to do at the time due to their lack of an industrial base and economic stagnation. The Russians had planned on completely modernizing their armed forces with new ships, next-generation fighter aircraft, but all these projects kept getting delayed as a large part of their research and development was financed with weapon exports, which had plateaued in recent years, and the defense industrial complex was extremely overburdened with the increase in demand of locally produced components. Russian society at large was also suffering from a brain drain as more and more educated Russian citizens left the country to find better opportunities abroad. Moving forward to 2020, a new armament procurement program was implemented which led to the rapid growth of state defense orders and the defense budget of Russia. And while this did breathe a little bit of life into the Russian defense industrial complex, this growth exacerbated the existing problems in the Russian system. Insufficient funding of research and development leads to technology stagnation, issues with attracting military recruits and specialized personnel deteriorates the quality of the armed forces, the ongoing diversification of military production strains the limited industry, sanctions prevented any meaningful industrial improvement, and total dependence on exports kept the Russian economy stagnant, corrupt, and uncompetitive. All in all, it looked extremely unlikely that there would be a successful military buildup. So now that I've outlined the problems with the Russians expanding their industry, let's take a look at their existing industry. Russian machinery, tools, and facilities have been suffering from underuse and deterioration for years, and companies are basically forced to use this outdated equipment as renewal efforts have largely failed to generate enough income to replace them. And when I say outdated equipment, I mean really outdated. The machinery and tools in these factories is over 20 years old in most recorded cases. And it's not just the equipment that's outdated either. The average age of a worker in the defense industry is 58 years old. The low pay, low benefits, and the overall corrupt bureaucracy dissuades young people from seeking employment in this line of work. So let's mix all that in with the failure to induce criminal liability for violations of contracts, misapplication of funds, rapid liquidation of defense military assets, and you have a recipe for a dying military-industrial complex. All of that leads us to the end of 2021, where tensions between Russia and Ukraine flare up once again, as Ukraine and NATO hold a joint military exercise. NATO expansion into Ukraine is seen as an existential threat in the eyes of Putin and the Russian ruling elite, so he escalates the situation by building up forces along the border with Ukraine, and he lays out his demands for a guarantee that Ukraine will never join the Western Alliance and will remain neutral. This demand is obviously rejected, so in 2022, when Russia faces the decline of their industrial complex, economic stagnation, and a demographic crisis, Putin orders the irrational, unjustifiable, full-scale invasion of Ukraine. And if you've been paying attention at all since then you probably know that it isn't really going to plan. I plan on covering the reasons for Russia's military failures in a future video, so for now I'm just going to continue to focus on the issues with the defense industrial complex, which have only become more clear as time passes and more reports come out. We're dealing with defense plants going bankrupt, selling off their assets, liquidation of dozens of factories across the country, labor shortages, specialized equipment shortages, missing or stolen funding, and more and more and more and more. All of this is happening when the country is at war, and it severely hurts Russia's ability to sustain a long conflict with Ukraine, especially as Ukraine receives more and more military and economic support from the West. Now let's talk about something that's generating a lot of headlines: missiles. On October 10th, Russia launched almost 100 missiles at targets across Ukraine in an attempt to destroy the country's important civilian and military infrastructure. And such a large barrage led many of us to wonder when the Russians are going to run out of these medium and short-range warheads. But according to some sources, the Russians have only expended about half of their available reserves. And while that might look bad on the surface, there's more to the story. Russian missile producers are unable to keep up with this expenditure. Two of their highest output factories are only able to produce around 200 missiles per year. And that's even after Russia has continued to pour resources into these bankrupt factories. At this rate, they're firing off way more than they can produce. So it's likely that over time we will see a steady decrease in the amount of missiles being launched, and any new ones that are launched are going to be of noticeable lower quality, as Russia's electronic production is extremely inefficient and produces low quality products. So in conclusion, all the closures, shortages, and systemic problems in the Russian defense industrial complex stem from the same thing: a lack of funding. There's not enough money to update or repurpose aging factories, no money for state defense orders or procurement of new weapon systems, and no money to attract competent defense industry personnel. Russia was woefully unprepared for a long-sustained conflict, but Putin wanted this war. And now that he has it, he's going to have to reap what he sowed.